Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hello there, welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, where it is my job to provide you with the best learning experience on the subject of high-intensity strength training, evidence-based exercise, nutrition, and performance, where I interview guests that include some of the top health and fitness experts in the world, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, Bill Simone, Steve Maxwell, and Ben Greenfield, and many, many more. Apologies if you can hear a noisy washing machine in the background. I've been temporarily confined to the kitchen, and so hopefully my mic does not pick up the washing machine. In this episode, after popular demand, I got Skyler Tanner on for a part 2. Skyler Tanner has, I think, over 15 years of experience in kind of health and fitness and being a trainer coach. He is currently general manager, equity partner, and trainer coach at Efficient Exercise. He holds a master's degree in exercise science and has appeared on the 21 Convention, Paleo FX, and Dr. Makota's blog. Needless to say, Skyler is one of the top guys out there when it comes to strength training, and he is a very, very intelligent man on that subject in particular. In this episode, it was interesting because I took a lot of the answers he gave in the first interview and I probed him on some of those. So we do really get into the kind of nitty gritty of muscular recovery, nervous system recovery. Again, as always, how to kind of optimize hypertrophy and just, results from high intensity training and exercise in general. I also polled a few of you guys and you kindly submitted a number of very, very good questions. And I asked Skyler all of those questions and he gave some fantastic responses. So thank you for doing that and I appreciate it. And yeah, so that's it really. I hope you enjoy this episode. I certainly did. And if you get a moment, please pop over to iTunes and search Corporate Warrior and leave a review, as that really helps promote the podcast. Enjoy this one and I will speak to you soon. All the best. When we last spoke, you talked about training to momentary muscular failure. And you said that this has been one of those moments where I start quoting you. I was like, did I say that? You said muscle tissue takes, to recover back to baseline can take 48 hours. And you caveat that and said, unless you're doing, bludgeoning yourself with eccentrics, and which most of the studies are based on, where it's, where people take 7 days or longer to recover. What about as you become stronger? There's the view that as you're able to do more damage to your muscles through, I guess, putting greater loads on them, you then require more recovery. So as you become more of an advanced trainee, actually you need to extend your recovery time between workouts. Do you think that rings true, or what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, in the literature, so going back to kind of queuing this up for the for maybe people who missed that answer, and I can give a longer form version of that, like, the eccentric loading that these people are experiencing in these laboratory conditions are inhuman. I mean, it's something very few people would submit themselves to in a workout for, even if they really wanted hypertrophy, they wouldn't submit themselves to it. So that's one. Number two is, as you get bigger and stronger, your ability to tax your body does increase, but simultaneously your resistance to drastic changes from homeostasis also increases. And so that's kind of the initial hit thought. It's like, well, if you're, and mind you, it's a great tool, this idea that, well, if you're not getting better in some capacity between this workout and the next workout, add another day of rest to allow that last little shove over the finish line. And for a lot of people, this is a good idea, and it's a good idea for reasons that have almost nothing to do with actual resistance training, because stress is stress. And unless you are a college-aged male whose main stressor is, do I really want to go to math class, or, oh, so-and-so didn't call me, well, I'll call the next girl, or whatever. You're in a position where you don't have real life stressors working on you. And, we were talking about this before the start, where I personally have kind of moved back towards a more minimalist HIIT type routine because of the circumstances of my life. moving houses, getting ready for a second kid, and a variety of other things in my life means that if I want to feel better more days than I feel worse, that works well for me. I mean, I'm still active, but that's a good tool for me because I have so many stressors. When the stress level kind of drops back down to something closer to baseline, I can add a number of working days of training days. So getting back to my point, though, is that it doesn't follow that you sort of push recovery out into perpetuity, right? This idea of like, if I could just manufacture a perfect stimuli workout, then, and I'm really strong relative to where I started, then I need 12, 13, 14, whatever days of recovery, because you as an organism get resistant to that level of fatigue. And if we're using inroad, yes, the relative percentage of inroad might stay the same, but the absolute amount of inroad is greater because you're stronger. Nonetheless, you do cultivate some amount of ability to recover more quickly. And it's important to note, too, that when I'm talking about recovery, I'm talking about when muscle protein synthesis sort of returns to baseline. So if you look at if you look in the literature, it's 48 to 72 hours, somewhere in that space. And it's the opposite. If you look at it on the front end, why did everybody jump in and go, you need peri-workout nutrition, you need post-workout nutrition? Immediately, the post-workout window's closing. But really, your elevated protein synthesis rates, not protein synthesis above baseline, but the rate at which it peaks out at 24-ish hours after a workout. And what that means is that as long as you eat like a normal human being, maybe a little bit more protein after a workout, you're going to benefit nutritionally as much as possible. You don't have to slam a shake right after a workout. Similarly, on the back end is that when 48 to 72 hours is really when muscle protein synthesis rates return to baseline. Now, there's more to a workout than just muscle tissue, though. And that's what we were talking about last time, where if you're doing, that doesn't mean then the corollary doesn't happen. It's like, okay, well, now you're at baseline and now you're going to start losing muscle. That's not going to happen either because you're a free living human being who is assumedly healthy. The idea is that you could do another workout if your hypertrophy above all else is the goal. But of course, it's a balance of lifestyle. It's a balance of genetics and other recovery elements, because there are plenty of people where the muscle tissue is capable, but the central nervous system component of pushing fatigue is very strenuous. That last 5% requires a whole lot of nervous system input that you can't summon day in and day out. We talk about overtraining, and overtraining in the short term or overreaching is very real. And overtraining as a overarching state is something that we use it really to mean it's short-circuiting your goals, right? That's kind of what we talk about overtraining. Well, you're doing more than is necessary to get the job done, and as a result, you're hurting your gains. But there's actually something called overtraining symptom. I forget which S it is, but it is, you don't really see it until you get into these giant amounts of work that's done by like ultra marathon runners. There's a great article recently, I want to say in either Competitor Magazine or Runner's World Magazine, where they talk about these people who all of a sudden, like out of the blue, they start having heart palpitations and their body just says, nope, you can't do this anymore. You're done. And people have to take months and months and months off before they can even resume the lightest activity. So most of us aren't at risk for that. We're not doing hundreds of miles a week running or the type of mileage necessary to train for a triathlon. That said, though, that 48 to 72 hours muscle tissue recovery, that means that you might, once a week might fit better with your life. You understand that you're not sort of getting the fastest amount possible, hypertrophy possible. Understanding that twice a week isn't twice as good, but it's better. And finally, that sorry about the camera cutting out there. But then the thing you also have to understand is that the corollary isn't true that because you are very, very strong, that you can get strong enough to have this incredibly protracted period of recovery. Because you're sort of, you become more robust to these giant deviations from the norm. I mean, we're homeostatic organisms at the end of the day, and there's good literature that shows that advanced trainees recover aspects of their training faster, aspects of their training faster than a novice does. And some of that seems to have to do with the fact that they're fairly well trained in the movement, that, there's only so many good exercises, right? So there's a familiarity with them. You're not overworking to compensate for the fact that you have a low skill in the movement. So advanced trainees seem to have this ability to not what the hip guy sometimes called off-road or offload, where you're doing a whole lot of work and it's spreading away from the muscle tissue that you're intending to train. It seems like a knife edge of precision, deep work, and then they can recover from that more quickly because it didn't go all over the body. It's like you don't see too many really advanced trainees using gross body English to accomplish their goals. They're really good at going to strict failure because they're using a lot of weight.
Is that the same as why they might go from, say, a compound exercise to a single joint exercise? The more advanced trainee, perhaps, or not?
I mean, well. So this gets into sort of what the demands of hypertrophy, which are in the biomechanics literature. There's good evidence that shows that in these compound movements, you will preferentially load into the bigger muscles in the chain. That doesn't mean the biceps and forearms don't work on a pull down or a chin up, let's say, but the lat's going to drive that ship. So following the big compound movement up with a smaller single joint movement is a way to ensure adequate training effect in the smaller musculature. And it's actually a kind of a 30,000 foot view guide I gave to a dental student I had a consult with recently. She's a daughter of a client of mine. And I was explaining to her like sort of gross. So I'll slide step slightly. It's understood in the literature that sort of hypertrophy is driven by strain. It's driven by metabolic effect, localized increases in tissue metabolism, and also just microtrauma in general. I mean, so the actual getting enough microtrauma in there. And the thing that I kind of pointed out to her, and I said, if you want to think about it at a 30,000 foot view, is you want to master the basic compound movements. You don't want to change them very often, and you want them to be what is driving a load base in your protocol. You move a lot of weight with the leg press. You can move a lot of weight with some sort of chest press or bench press. And that strain is going to hit everything in the chain. But you can then be focused more on higher rep work or sort of drop sets or breakdown sets or sort of some of the more metabolic hit type protocols or sub protocols, and change your exercises more frequently with the smaller movements. You can do different variations of bicep curls because not being good at them is in fact good for that metabolic effect, right? The more skilled you are at something, why don't our hands cramp like they did when we were writing lines as 12-year-olds? How much can we write? Well, maybe not now because we all type on computers. But I'm using an example. Something that we're really skilled at, we can just do without thinking, and we exert so little effort to get it done. But if you want a metabolic effect that might stimulate hypertrophy, you don't want that. You want to actually be kind of a novice at that, but you don't want to major in the minors. So if you're constantly changing exercises and you have no kind of foundation or anchor exercise to help tie everything together, then you're never getting past that learner stage. So the idea that a more advanced athlete might go from the big compound exercise to the smaller exercise is an example of kind of that, where they're moving so much weight. What happens is they don't have the margin for error. And when they reach strict fatigue, they can't even, using the body English is what's going to get them hurt, not the fatigue itself. So then going to do the smaller compound exercise is a great way to increase the localized metabolic effort of the muscle tissue.
Okay, cool. Related to that, and you've already touched on it already, but regarding nervous system recovery, how is that relative to recovery of muscle tissue itself? Is it approximately? Is there a rough time scale that people recover within, or?
It's really tricky because this is kind of uncharted territory. I'm not going to make any giant declarative statements about the recovery of it's not the nervous system tissue per se. It's the ability of the nervous system to summon those fibers to sort of infinity. It's largely environmental too. Like something in the BBC documentary, in which they did The Truth About Exercise. There's this experiment where they have him in a low oxygen state exercising, and then they put this sort of quasi halo unit over his head that when they fire it, it creates some sort of current that they figured out. And I haven't researched this. I looked at a couple of papers and go, oh, that's interesting. So I don't remember the exact mechanism. Sorry, viewers. But what it did was it sort of short-circuited the brainstem that was holding him back from working harder. So what that tells you is that the muscle tissue is capable, but the nervous system was unwilling because of the fact he was low oxygen. So all the math going into your brainstem is Tim Noakes, who basically wrote the book on running, calls it the central governor theory. And people hate that because they hate the idea that something in your body is keeping you from performing maximally. But in school and graduate school, we talked about it all the time. There are all these receptors, baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, your proprioceptors that are all feeding back into your brainstem that are making a rough calculation of what's considered a maximum capability in that moment. And similarly, I mean, in some of the pain research talks about this as kind of an example of how little we know about what's going on in some of the nervous system tissue, where the ability of a person to exert in a position of danger is less than in a position of safety and stability, right? This idea that there's a whole lot going on beneath the surface that is calculating what you are capable of giving in the current moment. So when we talk about the nervous system kind of delivering, that's a lot of what we're getting into, where if you compound the fatigue required to get a muscle tissue to not only full recruitment, but then trying to drive that recruitment to infinity, where you get that almost rigor mortis, where I'm pulling as hard as I can and I can't budge the thing. That requires a lot of juice from the nervous system. It increases what's called rate coding to try and get there. Rate coding is the stepping back. When you do a muscular contraction as you're, say, curling a weight, your muscles are sort of the motor units, these bundles of muscle fibers that are innervated by a common nerve, are kind of turning on side by side like this. And then as fatigue mounts and they're generating this force, it goes faster, 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 bam. And it turns on and it can't, and you're trying to turn it over faster than it's capable of turning. So it's effectively stuck. And then when you cease the set, you can go back to contracting. But because the demand of the contraction is so much lower, you can do it again. But that summation of maximal rate coding is really tough to do voluntarily, right? And as a result, we call it fatigue for lack of a better term. But your ability to summon that again in a short period of time or even a couple of days to that zenith level seems to be reduced. Similarly, I mean, it's kind of like muscle tissue we were talking about earlier. You don't want to come back to it too soon because you want maximal recovery. But then even if you did come back to it too soon, and this is a spinning your wheels example, there's something called the repeated bout effect, which is if the proportion of the recovery is related to the proportion of the fatigue, the repeated bout effect keeps you from fatigue, or helps to reduce you from fatiguing further after you've had a bout. So in other words, you prevent further muscle damage if you come back too soon.
Right.
And so that's a kind of a long way around the question, but the nervous system is like the great unknown, and a lot of people are doing a lot of good work with it, but it's kind of like looking in the window of a house. Right now we could see some of the stuff going on, but we can't get inside yet and really figure it out.
Okay.
It's coming, but it's just not fully there yet.
Interesting. Very cool. Okay. I'm just some of these questions I have we've kind of answered within that, so that's fine.
Sure. Well, I think I can add on to that, which might be a little bonus, something I picked up I think since the last time I talked to you. Or maybe it happened right after I talked to you. I don't remember everything we covered, but you might remember. Did I talk about I can tell you about this. So there's actually been done a couple studies. One was out of a lab in California where they're talking about the number of muscle cells are huge. First of all, you could hang them on a tweezer and we could see them. They're just big cells. Yeah, they're big cells, and they have lots of nuclei, myonuclei as they're called, to help govern the workings of the cell. And so a lot of hypertrophy literature is now starting to get into the idea that, we historically what has it been? You're going to just work harder and you get the Arnolds of the world. And then there was this idea that, it was limited by protein synthesis, and that's kind of where you got steroids. And make no mistake, steroids work fantastically for that goal. But then even then, there were some guys your average steroid user is a white-collar male, right? And they're not huge. They're not bodybuilder size. So there was clearly like, okay, this protein synthesis is increasing, and yet not everybody's turning to Arnold. What's the limit? Well, maybe it's myostatin. And myostatin is in fact this limiter. But it seems also now, as we get into it, like the number of nuclei within the muscle tissue might be one of the things that help to influence the effect. If I remember correctly, like it influences the effect of hypertrophy, because if you don't have as many nuclei as the next guy, think of it like think of almost like territorial governors. Like we found some new world and there's a governor, but the governor can only govern 100 square kilometers or something like that. If you don't have enough governors, you can't grow the territory. That's kind of how it is in the muscle. If some people just have way more nuclei than other people, and that it's permissive of more hypertrophy.
Interesting.
And it's not a protocol-based thing, because, as we're learning too, there are certain markers that would indicate sort of a better or a worse protocol. And what I mean is, you've seen in the literature that there's been some work now about lower weights and higher reps will get you about the same hypertrophy as higher weights and lower reps, assuming you get to fatigue.
Yeah.
And that's true. A caveat to that is it's a miserable experience to do lots of sets of like 30 repetitions and the pump. It's like the Katsu training, which is this blood pressure, this blood cuff around you sort of keep the blood from leaving the muscle. Yeah, it works for hypertrophy. And it's miserable. So the more moderate weight is a way of just getting enough strain, and it's a little bit more pleasurable because you should enjoy your training.
Yeah.
But they've done some studies on rugby players where they've had within group where they had these different protocols. And some of the players went through them and they were taking blood samples, seeing changes in like testosterone and cortisol and other markers and measuring their progress. And then they had one group is doing high weights, low rep, and the other group is doing low weights, high rep. And these are all pretty elite rugby players. I don't want to say South Africa. And then after a period of time, they flipped the study and they had the guys who were doing the higher reps do the lower reps and vice versa. You get some guys just gain a ton of muscle and their blood markers all look better on higher reps. And the moment you put them on lower reps, but we need low reps for strength and hypertrophy, they got weaker, smaller, and their blood profile showed poorer profile. So less cholesterol, more cortisol. Right. So this idea that this is a biomarker to give you a directional accuracy where it might be like you're a big, strong guy, but you respond better to lighter weights and higher reps or lower weight or lower reps and higher weight. It's hard to, what I'm saying is that you can't really tell that on the outside. Right. But now we're starting to understand that your body can give you clues if you had a team of lab technicians giving you blood draws.
Yeah.
So that there is a spectrum of usable protocols and of usable weights. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of getting enough strain and enough metabolic fatigue for your phenotype and allowing for enough recovery for that to manifest. You're not going to be able to work out tomorrow. When you're young, when you're a novice, you can work out in a couple of days. As you get stronger, you see bodybuilders sort of bias into these split routines. And there's a reason for that, because even though the muscle tissue might be recovered, the ability to summon the amount of work that's required to sort of tick these boxes from a nervous system perspective is hard to do with those muscles again.
Yeah.
So soon afterwards.
Yeah. Interesting. That what you just said about the guys that suddenly switch to high reps, low weight, gain more muscle,
or vice versa. It went both ways. Both ways. Yeah.
So, I've kind of gone back to freeway split from Body by Science. The big five, splitting that down.
Sure.
And obviously that is low rep, probably reaching failure within 60 to 90 seconds.
Sure.
So if I were to switch that to experiment with a lower weight, therefore more repetitions, but still one set to failure, would that be a worthwhile experiment to see the benefits?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a great example of something that a person can do where I have found personally that I do better if I'm doing a slow, high-intensity type training protocol. I tend to do better with lower reps, lower time under load, but not too low. And this is something that Fred Hahn of the Slow Burn fame, Slow Burn Fitness Revolution, the joke is Fred just does powerlifting with machines. It's like, well, that's a blunt instrument description, but that might be better for a lot of people. The ability to push themselves at those longer time under loads is miserable, right? And so for them, they would be better off doing heavier weights. But some people, the ability to do heavier weights just like kills them. Like they just have a hard time getting back in the gym and staying motivated by that.
Yeah.
So I do suggest experimenting. I mean, I think for a lot of these guys, in controlled environments, you probably end up finding akin to what Doug talks about. And way back when he wrote his first ever book, he's sort of sheepish about this book, the Ultimate Exercise Bulletin 1, as he called it, because he's like, it definitely has the whiff of the newly converted. And he talks about this idea of the signature time under load, where a person, because of the unique makeup and distribution of your fiber type, may settle in, and accordingly, each fiber has a certain sort of rate of fatigue. And mind you, this is a bit pie in the sky. Everything is perfectly just so. My recovery is on point. I have no external stressors. But it's hypothetical that sometimes shows up in the field. Is why I'm telling people about this. This idea that you would fatigue within a very narrow window, assuming the weight was relatively the same. When I was like 20 or 21, my training partner and I, we had a It was Tuesday night every week. We'd go in and we'd do a big 5. And I can remember on the leg press, it was Nautilus Nitro leg press. And I fatigued at a minute and 43 seconds plus or minus 5 for 6 straight months. And the weight went up about every week.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but at some point that's the other thing was like, as the weight gets heavier, it actually biases towards changing the fiber type in the tissue towards more faster twitch.
Yep.
It'll act, and I tell this to people too, is like, but then on the corollary is that it actually, some of your fastest twitch get turned into slower fast twitch fibers.
Right.
Which is a whole nother discussion about sort of fast twitch athletes. And people go like, well, they're not really doing a lot of heavy work. I go, because the heavy work is slow. And the slowness actually, it seems like funny to say like it makes them slower. It's not that it makes them slower. It's just their time is better spent getting just enough of that weight training to make all of the fibers that they have as strong as possible without changing that ridiculous cheetah-like quality that they have. And you might have seen this floating around on the internet because there is a genetic component that's a big time. I think it was a British hurdler, 110-meter hurdler, who had his thigh. They did a muscle biopsy of his thigh recently, and the amount of these, he's like 70% of these zenith fast twitch fibers in his thighs. Like, so it's not even just like the fast twitch phenotype as a broad spectrum. It's these zenith fibers, these fastest of the fast fibers, these myosin heavy chain 2X, which goes into another discussion. I think that's what they're called, or because we're up to like 7 fiber types now, mind you. We sort of talk about fiber types as slow and fast, and as our instruments get better, you see it's a gradient. But the fastest of the fast that we can currently measure this guy was like 70%.
That's crazy.
And no training is going to change you or I into a 70% like fast twitch fiber guy. Similar to high jumpers, right? High jumpers would be a great example of people who are probably almost predominantly this sort of fast twitch fiber. Because have you ever seen a high jumper? They're like stick men. They are tall. They have legs like quarter horses, and they can throw themselves over an 8-foot bar once. And then they got to rest for 5 minutes to do it again. It's just, they can produce a lot of power one time.
Yeah.
And so going back to what I was talking about with the signature time under load is that as you get stronger, you're going to change that. And that might actually start to lower the time under load because the load is getting higher, and you're starting to bias some of these intermediate fibers that are plastic towards a faster twitch, lower endurance outcome.
Cool. Okay. Question from a listener. I'm going to try not to butcher their names because most of them are American, and I suck at trying to pronounce some of these names. Although this chap's not. Hassanain Kubba is his name. And he said, what is the difference in optimizing hypertrophy? You probably answered some of this already. What's the difference in optimizing hypertrophy by going to the gym twice a week and not eroding muscles so deeply, by stopping as soon as I, referring to himself, reach positive failure compared to the body by science once a week approach?
Sure. I think, Doug, what's the difference? He said, what's the difference?
Yeah, in optimizing hypertrophy. So...
Okay, so
to both achieve the same end or not, I suppose.
So I tell my clients twice a week is better than once a week, but it's not twice as good, right? And momentary muscle, and I think we may have talked about this last time.
We did touch on it.
We touched on it a little bit, but I want to reiterate that momentary muscular fatigue is a great tool early on because most people are not working as hard as they possibly could. But once they can go there, kind of at will, that deep inroad stops being a useful tool. It became a really good signpost. It's like, I know how to get there now. So how do I get close to that, as close as necessary to get the benefits without the negative repercussions of, say, protracted recovery period of the central nervous system? You could do twice a week. And I think for a lot of people, twice a week is a good tool because they don't have the machinery or the equipment that would allow them to sort of do this one shot. All the conditions are perfect to manifest the best result. Now, again, twice a week is not twice as good. Going to momentary muscular failure is a good signpost that you've worked hard enough to simulate whatever your body is going to give you from the workout. There's no magic in it. It's a good signpost. And if you're going to do one set of an exercise, you're going to have to probably do that. If the machine is janky or it's a weird free weight exercise, maybe a drop set after that. But the drop set just accomplishes some of the more of the metabolic stuff that we talked about earlier. It in and of itself, it's just more work, and that's going to get the metabolic effect. And you can do it with a different exercise. You can do it with the same exercise with a lighter weight. From a hypertrophy perspective, twice a week is probably better, but it's not. It is better, but it's not twice as good.
Do you still believe that it falls on a spectrum, obviously, that you get those that take a long, long time to recover, and there's others that can recover very quickly? You still feel that it varies? Sure. And obviously the stresses, etc.
So I'd actually suggest it's a U-curve, and then I would also talk about the life stressors. So I think early on you get these novices who don't have a lot of muscle tissue, and they also are very poor at using their limbs or using their muscle, right? I mean, they don't have the skill. There's sort of a skill to working hard. And what happens is they come into a workout and they do it the first time, they get really, really sore. Okay. And then they'll have somebody who says like, oh, you don't need to work out so much. That's true. But I think those people are probably better served early on.
Yeah, definitely.
By 2 to 3 times a week, actually. Full body routine would be a really good thing for them. Because if we want to say that, and this part's true also, there's a lot of noise in the way in which novices recruit muscle tissue, that they don't know how to recruit it efficiently. So they work really, really hard trying to do something, and that is difficult for them to do. And as they get stronger and better and just put in, we use it for a lot of things, but in this case, it's literally if they put in more reps, they get better at doing the movement, and then they get better at doing the movement, so then they can use more of the muscle tissue, so they don't need to do the movement as often. So early on, you kind of you're going to use more tissue. You're going to need slightly higher frequency, and then as you get better, you're going to need a lower frequency. But then, if you're an advanced, you might need a higher frequency with less total workload, because. And it doesn't mean 3 times a week again. It means that you might need, this is where you see some of the guys who are doing they'll do their heavy workout and their lighter workout. And the lighter workout almost facilitates recovery. But you got to remember too, that these guys, it facilitates recovery because it's lighter, they're pumping the area, they're driving a lot of oxygenated blood in, they're almost using, whereas a long walk would be sufficient for this in their legs. Let's say a long walk with some maybe bodyweight squats or something to flush out some of the recovery or some of the agents from the recovery. So what I mean by that is when you train and the area becomes inflamed and you call on all these growth factors and your body remodels the tissue, well, the result, all the debris from that doesn't leave in the blood. It's too big. It leaves in the lymphatic tissue. The only way to get it out of the muscles to pump it out. Your body's sort of doing that at a slow rate. But in order to speed it up is some movement, which is why for some people, massage feels really, really good and their muscles feel better because it's been manipulated.
Okay.
And then you'll see these units, they call them sometimes TENS units, where they'll put on these electrodes and they'll just externally pulse the muscle tissue.
Right.
The muscle tissue contracts, relax, not under load. That's a way to help enhance recovery. And so for a lot of these guys who'd rather be in the gym, well, they go in and they just do light work. And that facilitates recovery because it's so light and it's just like a mild pump. Now, I'm not suggesting that a person does that, like who has health in mind, because at the end of the day, it is still a strain on your joints and tendons and ligaments. But if you accepted all the risks and you wanted maximum hypertrophy, and this explains some of the behaviors of the elite who could survive that workload, why they sort of go from a lot of work to less work of a higher intensity back towards a little bit more work, because that lighter work is facilitating the heavier work.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
That's like talking about Neil Armstrong's gait walking on the moon. It doesn't apply to the rest of us. It just doesn't.
No, it's really interesting what you said earlier there is about how, you become so much more adept at high intensity training or strength training in general, the more you do it and the experience that you build up. I remember when I first did the Med-X leg press, I would get to that point. Have you ever used a Med-X leg press before?
Oh, of course, yes, sir.
So when you just get out of the gate, it's like hell, right? And now, and now I can literally, almost full stack. So we're talking probably 410 pounds per leg. I can sit in that. Where it's really burning, where it builds up that fatigue very quickly. I can sit in that. Not. It's not a resting part of the movement. It's the hardest part of the movement, and then I can slowly come out of it. But that discipline, that ability to do that, has been, improved over time massively. And I just kind of realized it the other day.
Yeah. And part of that too is because of the way in which your tissue has remodeled to the demands of that.
Right.
Is something that we. This talks more to some of what people who are attempting to fix posture with exercise, or people who are constantly in this kind of shortened position for desk jobs. A lot of what the exercise is attempting to do is remodel the muscle tissue into a longer relaxed state through the adding of sarcomeres, which are the contractile proteins in the muscle tissue. First, you didn't have the capacity to actually produce good force at the bottom of the movement. And then that's when McGuff talks about muscle tissue being plastic. I mean, this is a great example of that, is that your body's going to adapt to the regular intense strains like that. So all of a sudden, being in the bottom of that position, yes, you are stronger. And there's been some remodeling of the muscle tissue to allow you to be more adept at contracting in that sort of stretch.
Right.
Force is the language of cells. Muscle cells no different. So when you're down in that position early on, most people, they can get down into, say, a decently deep squat, but then to have that sort of load on them, they're not used to it. And the muscles they're scrambling a little bit to meet your demand. So that's part of it right there is, yes, your muscles have gotten bigger and you've gotten stronger because you can contract them better, but also the muscle tissue has changed a little bit.
Right. Okay. Cool. Are you okay? You all right for?
I'm good.
Yeah, so
I'm good. I was just looking over, like a wife dropped down a text saying, "Hey, we're on the way home. Baby's asleep. You might have to put the dogs out before I get there." So I'm just like, "Oh, okay. I'll just be aware of." Did I bring the dogs in? Yeah, I brought the dogs in. Did I? Yeah. So that was all.
No problem. But as before, the great thing about you is I can ask you one question and you talk for ages, which is awesome. But it just means I have to really cherry pick my questions. But I want to make sure.
Cut me off, say that's enough.
No, because it's really good. Okay, so another question here from Scott Myslinski. He's asked, what are the benefits of macronutrient cycling? For example, eating lots of carbs on training days whilst limiting fats, and eating more fat on rest days with fewer carbs. So switching gears into nutrition.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the benefits? We can also include protein cycling too, and I'll touch on that here in a second.
Cool.
So globally, you're going to get it where you need it. I think the benefits are attempting to control for body fat gain and maximize muscle hypertrophy with minimal gains in body fat, right? If you just eat like a slob, you will gain some muscle and you will gain a lot of fat. The seafood diet, if you see the food, eat the food. The macronutrient cycling is attempting to put the, say, lower fat, higher carb around a workout day or the day afterwards, because carbohydrates they like to say carbohydrates spare protein, and they spare protein by reducing the use of protein for the creation of glycogen or glucose in the body, right? So when you go on a ketogenic diet, actually, it's not protein sparing in the short term because your body is making a lot of glucose to feed the brain from the protein you're eating. So carbohydrates in that sense are protein sparing because all the protein that goes into your body with sufficient carbohydrate load is there to rebuild tissue or support any of the other variety of factors that proteins contribute to, right? Yeah. Connective tissue, muscle tissue, soft tissue, functions in the body. The protein is used for those functions and not for making any sort of glucose required for feeding the brain or nourishing the gut lining or a variety of other things that glucose does. So the idea of, okay, higher carbs in around your workout, lower carbs in days you're not working out, feeds in that idea. It keeps the protein doing what the protein is supposed to do. It also allows for maximal muscular contractions because they're driven by glucose. But it's important to understand too that you do use in high intensity muscular contractions, you do use glucose, but you don't use nearly as much as you think. Like in his book, The Ketogenic Diet, Lyle McDonald worked out, or he talked to a biochemist and worked out. It's like 2 sets of 10 reps, I think, might burn something like 10 grams of carbohydrates or 20 grams of carbs. Not a whole lot. And then I corroborated this with Bill, and I'm butchering I forget how his last name is pronounced, and I can link you to him on Twitter. He wrote a book called Calories Proper, or The Poor Misunderstood Calorie. His handle is @CaloriesProper on Twitter. And I said, hey, is this formula are used to this? Because he's a PhD in nutritional biochemistry. And he gave me an alternate formula, but he was basically like, yeah, that's the formula. And so, yes, it is. It uses glucose. It uses carbs for power and contractions. But it's not like I got to get 200 grams of carbs down before my workout to power my 30-minute workout. It's just not that many. I've calculated it for your average 20-minute HIIT workout, and it works out to something like 30 grams of carbs.
So if I may interject,
you need a carb.
So are we assuming that a high intensity training protocol like the Big Five won't empty your glycogen stores completely, or is that different? Is that separate? Because I'm assuming
No. It's not going to empty your glycogen stores. Emptying your glycogen stores completely is a miserable process. What it will do. So here's where it's a bonus. by temporarily lowering the intramuscular glycogen content, you allow for a slightly higher rate of glycogen storage in the short term. This is some of the depletion type work that some of these athletes will do, where they try to super maximally store glycogen through depletion, this kind of yo-yoing effect. From a health perspective, that's really, really good because you always have a little bit of headroom for storing glycogen. So you reduce the risk of developing any insulin or diabetic type complications if you might be at risk for that, because sort of these transient increases in carbohydrate load and insulin, they're not problematic. It's a chronic issue. But if you have that, say, maybe if you have family history or you once had blood glucose issues, then it gives you this nice headroom and protection from it. But it's not enough to, we've got about, to put this in perspective, we store your average 180 pound, 75 kilogram male stores roughly 500 grams of glycogen in all of their muscle tissue. And the thing you need to realize about muscle tissue is it stores the glycogen and it doesn't give it up. It's going to be used on site. So in order to get rid of theoretically all of that glycogen, it's like mile 20 of the marathon, which coincidentally enough is where these guys bonk, right? These long distance runners. They're using it at about 100 calories an hour. So 25 grams of glycogen an hour, mile 20. If they're running when you calculate it out, it works out to about mile 20 is when they just run out, because it's about 2,000 calories, right? 2,000 calories of glycogen. And you don't burn nearly that, that's right. You don't burn nearly that many calories of glycogen doing a high intensity workout. It's not long enough, and muscular contractions, you're not doing enough of them. And the formula's also worked out for time. I can send that over to you if you want to post it for people to peruse.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I've worked it out for time because I don't count reps. I time people. So nonetheless, it's about the same. It's just it's a plenty, but we can't do enough work of a high intensity nature to empty the tanks in 20 minutes. It's just not happening.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so just because I kind of interrupted you as you were answering the question, which is a bad interviewer technique. But you were kind of saying about the benefits of macronutrient cycling.
Okay,
so I think you were kind of saying you agree with that there are benefits.
Okay, so there are benefits, but like so many things, it's like here in America, if there are benefits to unfermented soy, then what we do is like have our soy flakes with our soy milk and our soy everything. And then, the negative side effects come to be. I would say there are benefits to macronutrient cycling, and it's kind of like getting it's like the logistics term. It's the last mile, right? It's like, okay, you have enough protein, carbs, and fat? Yes. Are you of a healthy weight so that you maintain good insulin sensitivity? Yes. Is your goal maximal hypertrophy? Yes. Then you might find benefit in macronutrient cycling.
Yeah.
Is your goal like fat loss and you have tons of fat? Then you're probably not going to notice very much. Yeah. It's just your needs are much more of a volume issue than a timing issue. So so far as I'm aware, there's not a benefit to fat cycling per se. I'd have to go back and look. I could be wrong on that, but I'm not aware of anything that, other than the fact that you don't want high insulin and high triglycerides floating around in the blood, right? At the same time, that's part of the flip too. Is that one, fat slows down absorption of those carbs, but two, is you're trying to reduce the potential cardiometabolic complications that might come from spiking your insulin through the ceiling. And let's dump a lot of fat in there on top of that. Protein cycling is interesting though. And I say it's interesting because it's one of these like last 10 feet scenarios where if you temporarily lower your protein intake, your body will, there's a little bit of an autophagy benefit. There's even a longevity benefit. If a person, that's part of the chronic fatigue. That's the side effect of chronic caloric restriction is chronic fatigue. But the part of it is that the reduction in protein increases autophagy and reduces the anabolic environment of the body. So it's much more of a conservation environment rather than a sort of reproductive building environment. Okay, but if you cycle your protein, what happens is that you can kind of jog it back a little bit, and your body will then make room for, we'll sort of have this yo-yo effect for a very short-term increase in protein synthesis, right? So protein synthesis is a both availability within sort of as a result of the workout, but then also based on your protein intake or your protein intake in general. So if you in the short term reduce your protein intake, you will also increase, and then you start eating a lot of protein, your body can then use that to add to the protein pool, increase protein synthesis, but very quickly it goes back to baseline and it starts oxidizing protein at a greater rate, using it for energy. And that's what in recent years, a lot of the protein synthesis research has attempted to suss out, which is, okay, we do need more protein than we thought for maximum muscular hypertrophy. And how high does that go before we just start using it as an energy source preferentially, or at least to a larger degree? And that's where some of the literature, I'm here. You'll just have to edit that. My dog knocked it off of me.
Oh, I don't know. I think we'll keep that in.
There you go. See, that's it. You get the snout in between the headphones, and there we go. That's where a lot of literature has been. There's been an increase in the bandwidth of what's considered healthy protein or specific to the activity protein. Like, it's long thought endurance athletes didn't need much in the way of protein at all. I mean, they needed the protein, but not as much. Where when I was in grad school, the literature was saying somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6 grams per kilogram is a good range. And then they're saying strength athletes, it was like 1.7 to 1.9, 1.7 to 1.8. So pretty close, right? Because at the end of the day, like, endurance athletics is a pretty catabolic thing.
And then you got bro
science. So they do need more protein, right? And and in order to maintain that muscle tissue. Whereas so that bandwidth has increased as our ability to measure these things have increased. Whereas the changing of these cycling of the protein, you'll see an increase to the ability to turn a higher percentage of the protein and donate it into the protein pool in the body, rather than oxidize it as energy, increases temporarily if you had previously reduced your intake. The exact numbers, I forget. I could dig that up in articles pertaining to that that are more easily understood than what we might see in a typical research on protein synthesis, because it's pretty dry and boring. But it does exist. But again, it's like your average Joe or Jane, cycling of the carbohydrates is a way to control for fat gain if their goal is to gain muscle, because you do need a caloric surplus. Having more protein on your workout days is a fine idea. I'm talking like a protein shake or a little bit more meat or whatever. Yeah. A little bit more, right? So instead of having this kind of, okay, here's my baseline, I'm spending a few days below it, I'm spending some days really high above it, you could just have your rough baseline, which is kind of probably doing this anyway, and then on your workout day, just a little bit more to go with your carbohydrates. That's really you're going to get the vast majority of the benefit from that little change. No, I mean, that's it. That's all I'm saying. I think a lot of people, it's looking for the magic bullet. It's okay. I've been a skinny guy all my life. It's because I don't cycle my protein. And it's like, well, that's probably not it.
That's interesting what you said about, you mentioned about you need a calorie surplus in order to kind of provide the body what it needs to build muscle mass. Right. I've heard the converse of that, which is that, they've seen in I think it's in rats or something, that you can actually build muscle. There was actually a study of humans, so I can't recall the actual study, that showed that we can build muscle on a calorie deficit, albeit it's probably much harder. So where do you stand on that? And if someone's if I can answer, if someone's trying to get hypertrophy, is it really important that they get, a surplus of calories beyond maintenance?
So remember, when we say a surplus, it's not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's just making sure you're not in a caloric deficit. 1. 2, a lot of those animal studies, you saw localized hypertrophy, but then the rest of the musculature in the body actually reduced its gross or its dry muscle weight. Okay. Right? It wasn't, we hypertrophied the gastrocnemius and everything else stayed at maintenance. The weight came down, the muscle tissue that wasn't being trained was reduced, but the muscle tissue being trained was maintained or improved.
Did that occur in humans as well? Did you know? Or?
Right.
Sorry.
I mean, anytime you don't train, anytime you're not training and you're in a caloric deficit, this is some of the best literature we have on this is unfortunately in older individuals who are have some sort of reason to be bedridden, whether that's hospital. So there's a confounding variable. They're already sick and in the hospital. But sometimes it's for a break, right? It's for something where they don't have like a physiology problem. They have a blunt force trauma problem, and they're forced to be immobilized. And what ends up happening is they can't use their body as they normally would, and they'll see losses of 10% of total body muscle mass in a month. Whereas someone like you or my age, we might lose 2% total body muscle mass if we were just bedridden for mostly a month. And so it's a matter of degrees, right? it might be in these short-term studies they see increase in gastrocnemius musculature or whatever that's being trained, and the maintenance or the slight loss in these other tissues that aren't being trained, because it is a use it or lose it at the end of the day, right? If you're doing hard work with a given muscle and that guy gets bigger, it could have been that you just got better at recycling the protein that you were, or using the protein that you were using. It could have been that the total protein demand didn't go up significantly because it was, say, smaller tissue. A lot of the times it's what it is too. It's like we did it with the calf, or we did it with the bicep or the upper arm girth, and that's a relatively small percentage of the total body weight. So maybe given the protein load, that being a slight deficit, there was enough protein to maintain sort of homeostasis of the proteins in the body, but enough surplus of protein to allow for the rebuilding of this tissue. And it could have also been a novice effect, because when you have young kids who start training, they assuredly aren't eating in a total surplus, but because of the wackiness of the hormonal state and the extra energy they might have in just fat on their body, they can make up the difference in the short term. And that's the problem with any study, is that most of them aren't long enough to tell kind of, yes, you can see this in the short term, but is it sustainable? And is it something that we see in older individuals who are more trained, right? Yeah. Right. I mean, that's the trickiest part, because you know, at the end of the day, bodybuilders have made an art out of maintaining muscle tissue through losing weight, and they always have to increase the amount of protein they're consuming, because so much of that protein is just going to be used for other things other than maintaining their muscle tissue. Yeah. And if they haven't concentrated on a body part in a while, they might see a little bit of a gain. But it's not, the goal should not be to see, oh, and then also age plays into it. As you get older, you don't need as many calories to support a pound of muscle tissue. Seems to be some of the prevailing literature.
Interesting.
But that becomes like a yin or yang thing. Is that because you're doing less overall work with all of your muscle tissue, or is it because there's some change in the sort of metabolic dynamic of the muscle itself, and it's a chicken or the egg thing? We don't know.
Right.
So that's kind of where we're at on that. The goal should not be can I starve myself and gain muscle tissue, but simultaneously, when I say caloric surplus, I don't mean much. Right? Because the idea that was the old idea, like, oh, a pound of extra muscle burns hundreds more calories. And it's like, no, it burns like 50 more calories. You just have to do the math.
If I can interject on that, I've heard two different opinions on that. So Doug's, I remember in Body by Science, he said 50 calories, give or take 10 per pound of muscle mass. But Drew Bay I'm pretty sure he said 6 to 10 calories per pound. What does the literature say?
I mean, well, at the end of the day, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's the same, right? The difference of 40 calories per pound on an average human who might be able to gain 20 pounds of dry muscle mass.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's potentially a daily difference from start to finish of 400 to 800 calories, maybe, because again, as we get older, the muscle tissue is metabolically active, but it seems to require less calories to support. So there's a weird math that goes on there. 6 to 10. 40 to 50, it depends on the measuring. It depends on the tools being used to measure. This is part of some of the protein synthesis stuff too, is sort of like, well, they measured it this way, we measured it this way, and we found a difference. Then all you can say is that your instrument was different. But what they both are telling you is that it's not hundreds of calories.
Yeah.
And if you look at just basal metabolic rate, like at the end of the day, if your average 175-pound male is needing, with normal activity levels, somewhere between 2,200 and 2,500, and they're 15% body fat. What is that? About 140? It's about 148 pounds of muscle tissue, roughly, and some amount of that's going to be bone. So it just starts to add up to be where you're like adding a pound of muscle tissue can't burn hundreds of calories, because the muscle tissue you already have as a weight percentage isn't burning hundreds of calories. You'd be consuming many more calories just being alive from the dry muscle you have on your body now.
Yeah.
Right.
Skyler,
No.
I've got. I appreciate we've gone past the hour. Ivor, it's up to you. I've got one more question if you've got time.
Let's hit it.
Okay. Or we could do a couple more questions. Are you pretty? Is it a hard stop? Should we after this question?
Let's see here. 208. Yeah, for me, it's a pretty hard. I mean, let's answer one more question and then we'll see if we can't. We'll try and queue up a third.
We can always do a part 3 if you're up for it. I'm up for it. So I'm happy to do that.
Never-ending podcast, only because my answers are so long.
Exactly. Here it is. Okay, so this is by Tommy Holmlund. Is that right?
Okay.
Holmlund. Holmlund, I think that's how you say it.
Holmlund, that's what I'd say.
Okay. What are the advantages, disadvantages to the stress response after exercise by not eating anything at all after training, e.g. waiting 3 to 5 hours or more?
So McGuff has pointed out, and it's true, that after a workout, you're recycling protein in the muscle tissue.
I read that too.
This idea that you're pouring protein down your throat and it's going straight to the affected muscle tissue is kind of silly. It just doesn't work that fast. It's got to go be digested, and then depending on the protein you take in, they go, it's a fast digesting whey, and it's like, well, it's relatively fast. It's not minutes. It's not an injection of whey. You're still having to actually digest this stuff. So no matter what you do, you're not getting this immediate blood protein response. Not as immediate as people think anyway. You can obviously consuming work right after speeds it up. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the protein synthesis window is not this tiny little thing. It's much larger and much wider. So, and when you have that increase in protein synthesis, you can consume more protein and do with it. Kind of that old idea of, you can only consume 30 grams of protein at every meal to max it, and that's as much as you can consume. And it's like, well, if you are untrained and you're just trying to meet your daily requirements, yes, at some point, more protein in a meal starts to be oxidized for energy. You sort of fill the cup. The cup is full, and now the rest of it's being made to be used with energy. But even that's a little bit of I'm playing a little bit loose with the research on that, because your body will continue to have that protein before it's oxidized. If you just grossly overeat it, it's going to use a lot of that for energy if you don't have any demand on that protein. But if you have demand on that protein, your body will make use of it. So when 3 to 5 hours is really a drop in the bucket, especially if for 24 hours your rate of protein synthesis is elevated. As long as you don't say like, all right, I'm going to work out, and then it's time for that 18-hour fast, that's probably a bad idea. But your body doesn't do like quick accounting like that. It's not like this tiny little window where 3.5 hours, so I closed it. It's not that lossy.
Yeah. Okay. What other benefits do you think there might be from that fast? Is there any other benefits in addition?
Potentially increasing insulin sensitivity for that whenever you end up having that next meal. But again, I think that's kind of nitpicky.
Okay.
I think that, and I need to dig into this a little bit more. You could make a case that by making, did you just lose me?
I did for a moment.
Okay, let me come back to it here. There we go. And I'm back. Okay.
There you are.
See, I really wish it could just keep filming as I respond to my wife's text. I think you could, if you're really paranoid about longevity, the idea of really controlling the insulin, this idea that could it possibly concentrate the insulin in protein synthesis so as to keep the life extensionists from becoming too paranoid about anabolism? Yeah, if you're that OCD, that might be a benefit. But I think for free living human beings who sort of go, oh, that's nice, because you've read my blog post. You've read my blog post about life extensionists, and by all my friends who are biohackers, they go, they're the least healthy people on planet Earth. They know more about metabolic processes than researchers, and they're in horrible health because they're waiting for Ray Kurzweil to invent a pill that lets them live forever.
Yeah.
Instead of like, hey, I've got this body and I should take care of it now. And so then hopefully I live long enough to see the singularity. And so, but that's a slight aside. The point is, I can't think of anything that's like orders of magnitude better, but I also can't think of any downsides to waiting a few hours to eat. Because your protein synthesis is elevated, you're going to be fine. Yeah,
that's a great answer. Final question, I'm going to let you get on.
Okay.
Because this one's a real short one, and it's very different from what we've been saying. It's just kind of more, this is more about a kind of a philosophical question, and one which I'd like to hear what you have to say. I stole this from Tim Ferriss, actually, because he's been using this.
Should I park myself in my bamboo forest back here to add to that like guru?
Oh yeah,
guru vibe.
Whatever works for you.
I'll do that for the philosophical.
I think we got some forestry interference there.
No. I walked away from my Wi-Fi connection.
Oh, right. Never mind. Cool. Okay, so the question is, if you could put up a huge billboard anywhere in the world, where would you put it and what would it say? And this doesn't have to be health and fitness just because that's the theme of the podcast.
If I could put up a huge billboard, what would it say? See, I got this question at a talk I gave recently, but it was pertaining to health and fitness, so that one was easy.
Well, tell me both. Tell me like the health and fitness one and then the overall.
Sure. No, there's no such thing as a workout hero. Like, nobody cares about your workout. Nobody cares about how sore you are. Nobody cares about your sick pumps. Like, there's no bravado in the workout. There just isn't. Nobody cares. But to the more global sense is, I'm going to have to think about that. Because I've been thinking a lot about it with the second kid on the way, right? Yeah. It's like, how do I, that is good. See, this is something, this is one of those pondering ones. I'm sure I'm going to change. So I reserve the right to change my mind.
Caveat.
And in fact, that's humanity right there.
Absolutely.
Is that okay? This one I'm certain of. Nobody really knows what they're doing. We're all winging it, and that's okay. That's okay.
I love
it. It's something I said at 30. It was you get to 30 and you're like, holy crap, we're all adults, and we're just better at holding it together than our kids. We're more informed as to how much we're holding it together.
But you also become more and more aware of how little you know, right? Which is what I'm starting to realize.
Right. Sure. That's the joke, right? So, and I know it's very common there in the UK, but this idea that midwives are the ones who are delivering the children, and that the doctors are only there should something go wrong, like birth is a natural human process, not a medical condition to be managed. Oh God, you're pregnant. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this had to happen to you. We have this. I call her the woman who delivered my first kid, Roswitha. She's a German, and she's been doing midwifery for like 35 years. So she's just seen it all. It goes back to that kind of like blink test. She may as well be a mystic, because when you've seen a lot of something, you sort of like you recognize the pattern very quickly. And so it's a bit like the movie The Matrix, right? When Neo goes to see the Oracle, what is she but a poor woman in a housing project in what we assume is New York City, right? And she's just like making shit on the stove. Right? There's no grandiosity about her, and yet she's the Oracle, right? So Roswitha's kind of the same way. Like, every single one of the midwives defer to her. And you go and talk to her, and she's like, you're fine. It's a very non-assuming kind of thing. And I think that's kind of like that insouciance. As, at first you're sort of like, I got to be really, really great. And then you start learning how little you know, and how little you know, how much more you have to learn. And it's just sort of like, I'm on this great ride. This cruise is going with me whether I'm pushing it along or not. So I might as well try and have a little fun with it.
Yeah.
And enjoy it.
I love that.
So I wish I can't quite soundbite that so quickly, but I think we're all winging it to a certain degree, and understanding that everybody you meet is winging it to a certain degree might take the edge off a little bit.
I think that's the thing, is everyone kind of a lot of people surrender to ignorance is bliss. They don't want to get to understand, let's say, the complexities of health and fitness like you have and I attempt to. Or you sorry, you're working.
Let me put up my hand here. Let me put up my hand here just a second. No, but it's true. It's like, it's going back to, how many caveats and addendums have I kind of floated in here, right? Because it is true. It's like, the more I know, the more I'm like, well crap, I'm just gonna translate to the best of my ability, because we don't know nearly as much about hypertrophy as we presume to know. Yeah. And that is something that I heard firsthand from a guy whose lab is exclusively devoted to muscle hypertrophy.
Wow. Brilliant. I love that. So, but yeah, like you say, it's just, it's exciting. It's continuously learning. It's it's a big part of life. It's a big part of how we kind of obtain or realize that sort of durable fulfillment by always learning, So
sure.
I think that's...
Stay curious, stay humble.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool. All right, look, well, I'm going to let you get back to your day. And thank you so much for coming on again. I appreciate it, Skyler.
Yeah, man. Yeah, absolutely.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm sure there'll be a part 3.
Absolutely. Take care. I'll talk to you soon. All the best.
I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers,
Bye.
buddy. Bye. This podcast is brought to you by hituni.com, HITuni.com, the best website for online personal training courses for high intensity training. So whether you want to become a top level high intensity training trainer, or you want to maximize your knowledge on the subject of high intensity training to optimize your results, check out hituni.com, add your desired course to cart, and simply add the coupon code CW10 and you'll get a 10% discount. Thanks for your support.